This episode was first recorded in November 2017. Nels Anderson, what is your favourite game?
My favorite game is Thief, the Dark Project, from Looking Glass Studios. So I started playing games, actually. So I grew up in a tiny town in the middle of nowhere in Wyoming. For most non-Americans, and even some Americans, Wyoming is itself in the middle of nowhere. It's basically like, it is the least populous state in the Union. There are more people probably within like 20 blocks of my current home than there were in the entire state I grew up. So growing up in this tiny itty bitty place, we lived outside of town, like on top of a frozen mountain. So growing up, while we had a television, like the physical artifact, the object, a television, we had no reception. My family couldn't afford a satellite dish and, cable, antenna, whatever. Nothing else worked. So for like screen-based entertainment, I guess, once we got tired of watching the few VHSs we had over and over and over again, it was mostly cool video games. I don't remember exactly what year it would have been, probably maybe 1987? My family got, for Christmas, of course, the original Nintendo Entertainment System, like the 3-in-1 game thing that had Mario Brothers Duck Hunt and Super Track and Field, and it included the power pad, like, controller plug-in thing where you actually put down this weird plasticky foam mat and you had to run on it really fast. And of course, it was very easy to cheat because it was like the game itself was like a faux Olympics, right? But for the long jump, you could just jump off the mat and then jump back and then like land when you were very far down the course. But yeah, I played a ton of console Nintendo and Super Nintendo games growing up, and then I don't know exactly how much longer later, probably like the very early 90s. A friend of my mom's who worked for like a medical technology company or something in Seattle, big city where they have fancy things like computers. She was able to get him to buy me a computer because there was nowhere in my town that sold computers. Like, you could not buy one. I guess maybe you could have ordered it from like a catalog or something. But certainly no one in my family knew how to do that. But my mom's cool friend somehow heard that I was into computers because I think my elementary school probably had some. Like, we had like a computer lab with probably Apple IIs or something. So taking up like 90% of his suitcase when he came out to visit once was a 486. So, it was a cool computer with some flavor of Windows on it, probably Windows 3.1 maybe. And then, from there it was just crazy old PC games and everything from basically everything I could get my hands on in this weird, crappy, tiny town that I lived in, or borrow from friends or whatever. So, the Blizzard stuff and kind of the classic LucasArts things that influenced so many other people. And then it was always just kind of bouncing back and forth between Nintendo consoles and PC stuff. And that's largely, that's kind of just continued, until the present day, I guess, really. Yeah. So similarly, growing up in the middle of nowhere, I had no conception really of like making video games as a job. I guess like somewhere in the back of my idiot kid brain, I had to assume that someone somewhere did these things for a living, but I certainly never ever conceptualized it as like a job that I could do. Especially because growing up, a lot of the games I played came from like Japan or whatever, right? But when it was finally like 2001, yeah, I graduated high school in 2001, and even though I'd never done a stitch of programming, like the only even vaguely programming-ish thing I did was like building a crappy GeoCities website with some garbage HTML, probably. Despite all of that, I was like, well, I don't know. I think computers are cool, I guess. And maybe, like, I think someone, like, I'd gotten vaguely the notion that, like, obviously video games are made on computers, and well, if you build stuff on a computer, you're a programmer, so I guess do programming. So I enrolled at the University of Colorado, which is in Boulder, Colorado, just like a touch north of Denver, in a computer science department. And it turned out that despite the fact that I'd never done programming at all before I got to undergrad, especially like anyone, I do not buy for a second. Like people are like, oh, I never learned how to program and I've already been in the industry for like 2 or 3 years. It's like anybody can. You don't have to be like 7-year-old wunderkind. It's like I started programming BASIC on my TI, whatever. It's like anybody can reasonably do it, right? Yeah. Anyway, it turns out I had at least enough of a knack to to earn a degree in computer science, and I also simultaneously picked up a degree in philosophy because I thought it was interesting, not because I had any illusions that it would provide career prospects. And then when I was figuring out what I wanted to do, like after undergrad, I was basically torn between going into law enforcement or video games. So I applied to a bunch of universities for graduate school that had like information security type programs with, an eye toward joining the FBI or something. But this was also 2005. And I'm like, well, I'm not super excited about working for the government of the United States of 2005. And then when it came to all the different universities I got into for grad school, like all of them were all quite good in my opinion, but it was more about like, well, I could go to Johns Hopkins and live in Baltimore. I could go to Carnegie Mellon and live in Pittsburgh. No offense to Pittsburghians, but not exactly my bag. There's Purdue in West Lafayette, Indiana, or the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And I'd been up to the Northwest a bunch. I absolutely loved it up here. And I was like, well, what happens if I move to a different country? I don't know. Let's find out. And then I did it. And in doing so, I discovered that I do not like academia. Really. I appreciate it, but I know it's not for me. It's incredibly solitary work, and I hate working by myself. And I'm tremendously bad at it. So I got my master's degree and said I will not be pursuing a doctorate. Thank you very much. And at that point, I'd actually, Vancouver did and still does have a very vibrant game dev scene. So I'd actually met some people who actually really did do this for a living. And I'd also been volunteering at the at PAX, at the Penny Arcade Expo, as an enforcer, basically ever since I moved up to the Northwest. I did that for like 4 or 5 years, I think, like 2005 to probably 2010-ish. And in there, I'd also met a bunch of other industry people, and I was like, oh, this is a thing that just people can actually do. Well, that's cool. And then so that, I just started talking to game development companies here in town. Eventually, I ended up, my first like actual real gig that shipped a game was at Hothead Games here in town, working with, of all people, Ron Gilbert, the creator of Monkey Island. So that was, as a first job, that was surreal. Where it's like, I remember playing this game over at my friend's house in like 1993. And now you're interviewing me for a job. That's weird. But then it turns out Ron is actually just like a very chill, like extremely technical guy. So I think a lot of people don't know. They assume it's like, oh, he's like a goofy joke game design guy, but he's actually like an extremely talented programmer as well. So we just kind of connected as like, oh, technical people who like to make weird games. And then I ended up working at Hothead for like 2.5 years, I think. And then after that, I went over to Clay Entertainment because I wanted to pursue more like specifically design stuff. Ended up being the lead designer on Mark of the Ninja at Clay, which was awesome, which was great. I really enjoyed that place and that team and those people. It was fantastic. And then after Ninja was done, and I still feel extremely fortunate, but the reception to that game was, extraordinarily positive. So it felt like kind of that game, that project, accomplished kind of everything I wanted it to. I'm sure I can imagine some places, and this is totally fine. This is like part of the iterative nature of game development, right? But I'm pretty sure that like some folks at Ubisoft Montreal, for example, when they finish the first Assassin's Creed, they're like, okay, now we know how to make one of these games, and that's probably why the strength of like AC2 and AC Brotherhood is so profound. Is that like those games feel like the actual full realization of the ideas that were there in the first Assassin's Creed, but with Ninja, it was kind of like, oh, we kind of did everything we wanted it to do. So it didn't feel like I really had like work left to do on that particular like line of thinking, so to speak. And at that point, I did not have a child, did not have a mortgage. Well, I still don't have a mortgage because no one can afford to have one of those in Vancouver. But didn't have like any, particular filial or fiscal obligations. So I had been talking to a bunch of other industry friends and colleagues for a while, and a couple pals of mine, Sean Bannerman and Jake Rodkin, who'd been the two leads on the first season of The Walking Dead at Telltale. They were kind of at a similar point where they're like, that project kind of did everything we wanted it to do. And what if we decided to do something new and different and start up our own place? And they had ended up talking to this British graphic designer named Ollie Moss about, and Ollie he's just like an illustrator, graphic designer dude, but he'd been wanting to do something more games related. So the three of us all just ended up at a party at GDC, and they're like, we're thinking about maybe leaving Telltale and making a weird first-person game, to which I said, oh, really? Tell me more. So that eventually turned into Campo Santo. After just over 2 years, we turned that weird first-person thing did indeed become a game called Firewatch, which is pretty cool. And then after Firewatch, we did more Firewatch ongoing support. And then about a year ago, Campo was kind of like, all the post-launch support for Firewatch had been done. Like, it also come out, like the Xbox version was done, and that included a little bit new stuff. So it was like, okay, the Firewatch stuff is actually done. We need to really, figure out what the next thing is going to be. And just kind of like the collective wisdom, the collective intelligence, whatever, that drifted toward doing something that just design-wise wasn't particularly something that I was interested in. Again, all those people are fantastic. Like, I'd happily make some game with them again someday. Who knows? Maybe. But just the particulars of what they wanted to do next just wasn't super gripping for me. And I know ultimately in my career I'm not going to get to make an infinite number of games. So at that point I kind of struck off on my own, and then spent a while doing a bunch of small things, keeping the lights on while trying to figure out how to find some funding to actually pay other people to make a game, because see previous comment about how I hate working by myself. Eventually, thankfully, the good old government of Canada, well, technically an arm's length crown corporation, blah blah blah, basically the government. There's actually a funding program up here called the Canadian Media Fund, and while it does exist primarily to fund film and television productions, they do have like kind of a little off to the side corner. It's also for video games. So I rolled a big old proposal to them about what we wanted to do, and in due time, because the wheels of bureaucracy can grind a bit slowly. In due time, they said yes, and I said fantastic. So gave the thing a name, which is the new organization studio, whatever. I mean, it's all remote, so it's not like we have an office, but the banner we are all working under is called Caledonia, and right now it's just me and two other folks and some contractors, but we're making a new thing, and it's super exciting, actually.
What can you say about the new thing?
Nothing.
Damn
it. Sorry, buddy. Yeah, it is. It's kind of the only thing about, like, philosophically the way I'm approaching it is, and this might be an accidental but very strong segue. Kind of, I make no bones about the fact that Mark of the Ninja is basically just my love letter to stealth games generally, but Thief in particular. And so I think part of the reason why that game connected with people, and the thing that was very edifying for me as someone who absolutely loves stealth games, is hearing from people who had played Ninja, and they basically said, I thought I didn't really like stealth games, but then I played this one, and I loved it, and then after that, I went and I played Dishonored, and it was great too, and then I went back and played Metal Gear or whatever. It was kind of like, see, I knew the love was in your heart all along. It just had to be unlocked the right way. So what we want to do with the next thing is kind of do that again with a different type of a type of game that I love to death, but is kind of notoriously difficult for a broader swath of people to play, and maybe I'll be able to unlock a secret love in their hearts as well.
I think, as you say it, that conveniently ties into your favourite game. So let's talk about your favourite game.
I'm setting it up. I'm helping you out, Jenny.
All set up nice and convenient. So I am going to be straight up honest here. I have never played a Thief game.
No. Oh, breaking my heart. Wow.
I do have, though, a promo copy on PS4 of Thief 2014 Electric Boogaloo Reboot.
You can maybe give that one a pass.
It's worth noting that before we started this, Nels gave me a bloody proper heart attack because I've been going under the assumption that this is going to be about the original Thief, and he goes, wait, no, we're talking about Thief 2014. He was like, what? And I genuinely nearly had a heart attack on the fly because I had planned all the questions just on OG Thief.
OG Thief, that's right.
So basically, I get the feeling you do not like Thief 2014.
I mean, it's fine. It's the kind of thing that's like, obviously, some very talented people worked very hard on it, but I think that just, like, you have, like, building a game like that inside of like a huge publicly traded company is definitely challenging, and it requires like a lot, like a very particular vision and a lot of trust in the creative team. And I think that again, not to throw shade, it is a miracle that any video game exists ever. Like, they are an object that hates to exist, and yet you have to drag them kicking and screaming into existence.
Kind of the contra sorts.
Not that far off. Although that one happens on its own, whether you want it to or not. You can't stop that one. But kind of the difference between kind of just the level of trust and empowerment that you saw with Arcane Studios in Raphael Colantonio and Harvey Smith when they were making Dishonored versus Thief, the 2014 Thief from Eidos, where there was a lot more turnover in the lead creatives, and it just seemed like that they didn't, aside from, oh, we have the license to this game, it's like, well, yeah, but what do you want to do aside from just make a new one of those? And it seems that just that clarity of vision and that empowerment of the team just wasn't really there. Like in my opinion, like the actual contemporary successor to Thief for sure is Dishonored.
That is actually something that I was going to touch upon later on. It's that it does feel like such a spiritual successor to Thief, and even somewhat slightly, at least in regards to Dishonored 1 and its sort of art direction, a sort of steampunky Half-Life of sorts.
Yeah, I mean, Victor Antonov, is that it? The dude who did a bunch of the was it like art, like essentially he's like the architecture designer effectively. He did all that stuff on Dishonored as well, so you can totally feel that like that shared spirit there in a way that I think is very cool. Even though obviously the moment to moment in those games is quite different. But there is kind of like a weird soul connection between those two games in a way that I think is pretty cool.
I think for me with Dishonored, it's that Dishonored has taught me one fundamental thing about playing stealth games, and that is that I am not very good at them at all. And I would say one of the best stealth games of all time is in my top 3. Dear God, and I'm not very good at it or any other stealth game.
Good. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting, right? Is that like there's still a type of game that, you know, even when you're not good at it, they can still be enjoyable. Like the oh God, I got caught. What do I do now? Mad scamper around. While it may not create like the player fantasy of being the undetectable badass, it certainly has, you know, good, just like moment to moment dynamics that are really cool in a way that just being not great at Dark Souls or a first person shooter or whatever, it's like, oh, you get good or you lose. That like you have a lot more opportunities in a stealth game to just kind of approach the challenges in the ways that you do feel competent in. And I think that like high degree of player agency is like one of the big things that as a type of game just sets them apart from most other, like, you know, action adventure, whatever games where you are in control of a single avatar. That very like high level of intentional play and the really player centric like systems in the game are sort of like the things that make them different. And that's a lot of the stuff that I spent some time thinking about as we were building Ninja as well. So even though the presentation for Ninja is completely different, it's like, well, how can we still afford that stuff so this game feels like a stealth game, even though it doesn't look like one at all?
I think when you come to that, it does harken back to what you said about the game being a sort of love letter to the stealth genre for sure. And I think now looking forward, there are certainly... I don't even know what I'm saying anymore, but basically that's going to be a thing you hear often. But I think Thief going forward, it showed that it was a sort of, not even sort of, it was a fundamental, forgive the pun, game changer in terms of stealth in games, or even first person games as a whole.
Oh yeah, completely. I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, I don't know how much of this is just form following function or the other way around, but the fact that, you know, in Thief, by definition, like literally baked into the premise, the point of the game is that the other entities in the game, they don't know where you are. That's what the game is about. As compared to, it sounds trite, but actually it's like in nearly every other type of, like, you know, action adventure, whatever game where you're playing an avatar, the whole point is that, like, you walk over some trigger, some dudes get spawned, they come and blast you. Like, the game, usually those games aren't even implemented with any notion of, like, the game doesn't know where you are, because it's just baked into the fundamental assumptions of the game. Is that, like, well, the enemies know where the player is, and they're going to go get them. Which is fine, obviously. Countless amazing games exist that do that. But because of the premise of Thief, it's just like, well, we can't build a game where the enemies know where you are all the time, because then you can't sneak around them, and then you can't be a sneaky thief guy. But because of that, what that did is it just unlocked this whole different, just like, pace and almost just like player mindset about. And this is the thing that was so profound for me when I played it. Was like, when I played it, it was basically the first game that I'd ever played that felt like there was actually a world that existed inside of the game that continued to exist even when I wasn't looking at it. Because it's like, play Final Fantasy VI or whatever, which is still another one of my favorite games of all time. But, like, nothing changes in that game until you as the player with the the only bubble of actual agency in the world walks around and makes the thing happen. Because otherwise the world is just static, right?
It just stands still, basically.
Yeah. Which again is fine. Like, there's a bunch of other things that game does that does make its world feel alive and real. But with Thief, it's like, even when you're not around to see it, you definitely felt like, well, of course those guards are going to be over there patrolling. Or, like, if I leave this body here, somebody's going to find it, even if I'm not, like, in the same room when someone comes in. And it's just that, and then, like, kind of the high-level structure of the game, the way the different events fit together and stuff. Even though, obviously, that was, like, not as interconnected. It's just the game and the world of the game just felt so real in a way that, like, nothing up to that point, nothing I'd played felt. And it was definitely profound. And I think a big part of that as well is that, again, this kind of falls out of just kind of what needed to happen based on the game that Looking Glass was trying to create. But, most up to that point, certainly, but even now, most first-person games, it's like there's a world. There's like the level-based ones, the open kind of open world. The more recent Far Cry ones, those are a whole. That's a different kettle of fish. But the ones that have like discrete levels, right? They're very like smoke and mirrors-y amusement park rides, right? Where it's like, oh, yes, you're in this whole big town, but you can actually only walk down these 2 streets, and you can start at the beginning and go to the end, and that's basically it.
Basically, sort of like a sort of Ghost Train of sorts, in a way.
Yeah, the corridor shooter, if you will, right? And again, that's fine. You can have amazing moment-to-moment gameplay inside of that, and it's great. But Thief, its levels were so different because the spaces were built out like actual real spaces where, okay, you're breaking into this mansion. Well, that means this mansion is going to have like a wall outside of it, and then some gardens. There's going to be a main pathway that's brightly illuminated. There are some guards there. There's going to be a back servant's entrance. That servant's entrance is going to connect to the servants' quarters and then the kitchen. And then from there's going to be a passageway into the main hall, so you can already be, even though, again, you look at the game now, and it looks like a game from 1997, 98?
Yeah, 98, yeah.
There we go. Yeah, it of course looks like a game from 1998, but even then, the way this space is constructed feels like an actual, real, tangible place in a way that most video game levels that purport to be a real place totally don't, right? And, like, it wasn't just the architecture of the space, but the function of the space was also very well considered. Like, in most, again, I'm not dogging on other games, right? I'm really pointing these things out in terms of comparison. I don't think this is bad. It's just different choices create different aesthetic feelings, right? But, in most games, it's like, where are there bullets? There are bullets everywhere. There are bullets in the kitchen. There are bullets in the bathroom. There are bullets everywhere because there need to be. But in Thief, if you're like, in the servants' quarters, well, there's not going to be much gold to steal in there because the only people there are a bunch of poor servants. But in like the Lord's library, there's going to be a ton of stuff. In certain levels, it's like, the guard, when you're breaking into like, the prison, what is it? It's not Shalebridge. Shalebridge Cradle, that's the level in the third game that Jordan Thomas made that is my single favorite level in probably any game ever. Although there's some stuff in Dishonored 2 does kind of compete with that now. But when you're breaking into that prison, like the second level of the first Thief game, it's like, okay, well, there's a bunch of spaces where they're just prisoners in this weird like tunnel that you're climbing in through. And of course, there's nothing stealable in there, really. Oh, except you find this body that had some stuff on it, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that like not only is the space put together in a way that feels cohesive and tangible, but the actual like mechanical aspects of that space is also very well considered. It's remarkable, and it's still the kind of thing that just even a lot of games now just due to the way they're built and the type of experience they're trying to provide, it's just kind of not something that they can do. But because of the systems at play in a stealth game like Thief, that's just kind of the game you have to make. And it is very cool, and it's still one of my favorite things about Thief by a wide mile.
It's interesting that you say that for a game that looks like it came from 1998. The impression I get from it is that despite how it might have aged in nearly 20 years, it's a game that if it released today would incredibly hold up very well, at least in terms of gameplay and its mechanics and its world building and all that there. Like, it would still hold up today. Although, obviously you could argue Dishonored does that, but in terms of Thief itself, then it could still, be relatively revolutionary all the same.
Totally. And the thing too, and kind of like something that people have come to appreciate more, looking back on Looking Glass's work, is that, like, of course, kind of coming from the Boston game dev scene that was so full of incredibly talented audio people, most of which who went on to make Harmonix, that like the audio design in Looking Glass's games, but especially Thief, in my opinion, is so amazing. And that is something that just doesn't age the way that like a graphics engine does, right? That like the kind of the aural space that Thief lives within still holds up, so that even though obviously the guards are like, oh, that's like 64 weird triangles all put together in a funny shape, just the transportative effect that the soundscape has, I think, also helps that game hold up tremendously well. And obviously at the time it was just mind-blowing. Like, I don't think, certainly, like, maybe a little bit in Metal Gear, but even in the first Metal Gear, a lot of that stuff was very, scripted in cutscenes. That, like, just walking around this world in Thief, you could overhear this conversation between a couple of guards. It's just like this organic conversation. And sometimes it's just them, like, faffing on about nothing, talking about Taffers and the bear pit, right? But other times it's like actual useful information. But, and this is a thing that I think is still so bold about that game, is, it puts a tremendous amount of, trust in the player that they aren't going to need hand-holding, that there's, trust between the game and the player and the game, that, the world of the game is going to be presented in a way that is tangible and realistic and makes sense, but that also the game isn't going to, like, hold your hand, right? If you overhear this conversation between two guards talking about some useful, like, the key to the back door went missing or whatever, you're not going to get, like, a HUD pop-up that says, optional objective, find missing key, or whatever. So it's going to be like, well, if you happen to notice that, then the world is going to actually have that thing in there. It's going to be reactive, and you can act on that information in a way that makes sense. And the same thing with all the maps in Thief. And this is a thing that we kind of like, but very wisely, more than anyone else, the writer on Mark the Ninja, Chris Dolan, my buddy, he said because initially, we flirted with the idea of having like some kind of mini map in Thief, and Chris was just like, no, that's definitely not the right decision. He thought about it a bit through the lens of Dark Souls, because that's a game that Chris and I certainly bonded over. But it's absolutely the case in Thief as well, where the fact that, there is no mini-map. There's not even like a map, a Fog of War type map that gets filled in, right? The map you have is this diegetic map of the place that has like, some handwritten notes from Garrett on it, and that's it. So not only does the game kind of demand that you have to like map this physical diegetic artifact with the space that you're moving through, but it also carries like quite a bit of storytelling weight, right? Because like when you go to Constantine's mansion, for example, and spoilers, Constantine is actually just this crazy fairy god, like this very much like trickster, Oberyn, Pan, whatever type character. Like when you get the map to his mansion, like the outer areas are relatively well detailed, but the inside is just kind of like effectively a giant question mark. And then when you actually move into that space, the inside of that mansion is insane. There's like doors in the floor and walls like on the ceiling. Some of the spaces are turned upside down, these hallways that like twist and contort. I guess it's kind of like a crazy precursor to the Clockwork Mansion in Dishonored 2, just built on the tech you had in 1998. But, you end up having this incredible feeling where, you look at the map of that space and you're like, oh, I see why there was nothing here, because this is a crazy place. But if there was like a mini map that was constantly leading you around and showing, oh, here's how these 3 hallways connect, whatever, like it would just be a space, right? In general, I think that a lot of games do themselves a tremendous disservice, and this is like a huge. Well, cutting off your nose to spite your face isn't quite the right word, but like baby with the bathwater or something. Pick the right idiom, where people are like, oh, people in our game are getting lost. Well, let's put a quest marker on the screen. It's like, you can do that. That technically solves the problem. But that's like, kind of, in my opinion, that's like the nuclear option, right? Where it's like...
It breaks the trust between you as the player and the game.
Yeah, well, there's that. And then it also means that you never have to solve anything in your game in terms of like making the space clear or lead the player in a certain way or whatever, because you solve the problem by putting the quest marker on the screen. It's just like, just follow the marker, you'll get to where you're going. But that means that people completely check out with how they're perceiving the world. They just don't see the world in the same way, right? Like even I, when I try very hard not to do it, if there's a game that have a quest marker and I haven't turned it off, or worse, you can't turn it off, then you just don't notice the world in the same way. You just don't internalize the way that space is constructed, and it just makes the world of the game feel so much less real. There's just so many details you don't notice. That may be a trade-off. It's worth it. In some types of games, I question that thinking a lot. But certainly in a game that's supposed to have like a real tangible world, I think you just can't do that. And I think part of the magic of Thief is that, none of that stuff exists, right? That it's just like, here you go. Here's the place. You kind of got some rough guides on your map. Good luck.
Like I can see that kind of point of view, because if you get that kind of arrow pointing you towards the objective or towards the area, it just doesn't feel the same. That's why people say turn off the minimap in not Bioshock, although turn off the arrow in Bioshock.
Yeah.
Like, turn off the thing for that and just explore the world of Rapture, or turn off the minimap in Breath of the Wild. and just go nuts exploring that place. It, at the same time, as much as the game wants to help you, you get the sense as the player, you need to kind of feel more fulfillment by finding out these things about the world, the gameplay systems by yourself. It's more of a fulfilling thing.
Yeah. Well, and then also, like, the people who are building that game, you know, they have the 1-2 punch of, well, they built the game, so they kind of know where everything is. And then also, the game was built with the assumption that, like, the objective marker and the quest arrow, whatever, it's like, it's going to be on by default. So you never really have to do any kind of other wayfinding problem solving, because that thing will always just work. It's just like, it's just the most, you know, inelegant solution that cuts off so many other avenues for like solving that problem in interesting ways that are compelling, that like connect with people in a different fashion, versus just like follow the thing in front of you until you get to where you're going. Like, yeah, this is trying not to sound like too much of a grumpy old man on my porch, but I actually like have genuinely found numerous people who are so used to just getting from place to place by looking at the GPS map on their phone that they can't find their, like, with, you know, 2 hands and a flashlight, can't find their ass anymore, right? Where it's like, you try to ask them to like go to some place in the city that's more than like 3 blocks away from their house, and they're like, oh, I don't know where that is. It's like, you've lived here for like 12 years. So if you're so used to having some external construct from you, like, solve those problems, you just don't have to engage with the world, either our world or a constructed artificial game world, in the same way. You just don't have to pay attention and come to internalize and understand that space in the same way. And, like, I understand why those decisions were made, because it's like, well, you know, people getting lost in your game sucks, or that feeling of, like, the person playing the game not knowing what to do, that I think certainly that I understand why people make those decisions, but I very much worry that it's, like, essentially creating this learned helplessness in a lot of the audience, that even though, you know, doing the kind of, like, or not organic, or, you know, yeah, maybe kind of organic, but like the very like tangible present kind of just like wayfinding and internalizing a space and stuff like that inside something like Thief would be a very, like, exciting, unique, novel experience, that if people are trained to expect to have a big shining light pointing them where to go at all times, if they're presented with something else, they're going to be like, well, this is wrong. This isn't how things work. Even though there's a lot of satisfaction in doing that. So yeah, it's a whole complicated thing.
What would be the perfect solution, or at least compromise, in regards to player agency and that kind of waypoint, that kind of help in pointing the player towards destination X so they can get objective Y and stuff like that there?
Man, I don't... It's so specific for each type of game, right? That I think that, again, part of the reason for the proliferation of the quest arrow, the on-screen quest mark, on-screen quest mark or whatever, like, the reason why that is ubiquitous is because it always works, right? Like, you don't have to come up with some kind of solution that's appropriate for the fictional premise or the particular mechanical dynamics or whatever of your game, that you can just do. Like, this thing always works. I do think that even though there's a mini map or whatever in Breath of the Wild, like, I think that game actually does a lot of very impressive things with the way that world is constructed. Obviously, it's very different because that world is gigantic, and the way you solve these problems in a level-based context is completely different than the way you do it in, like, a big open-world game. And having never made a big open-world game, I can't really speak to it that much. But so in Breath of the Wild, you know, you kind of have these, like, major waypoints, like the big, huge unlock. I forget what they're called. Like the big towers you actually have to climb. There's only like a dozen of them. And then they have a bunch of like smaller, more regional waypoints, which is all like the little shrines. And then usually there are big geological features as well that almost always have something interesting. And there's horse stables and stuff. And so like that game does a lot of good work with having those like very visible points of interest, I guess, that you can kind of always head toward, and you're like, okay, well, I haven't been over there yet, so I'll just keep kind of moving in the direction of that big tower. Oh, I got taken down this weird gully behind these hills. I fought some moblins or whatever. But then you come out on the other side, you're like, aha, it's slightly more over to the left now, but I still kind of know where I'm going. Like already, I would say that, having played it for probably about the same amount of time, like the amount of world that I can like mentally recall in Breath of the Wild compared to most other like big open world games that I've played is quite stark. Like I remember far more of Breath of the Wild's world just in terms of how it's put together, just because it did do such a good job of like that kind of landmark construction. And with level-based games, they seem to be less common now. But I think that kind of that again, it depends a lot on the dynamics of the game, but something like the fact that all the buildings in Thief are built, aside from the few that very deliberately play against type, that they're built like coherent spaces, and you're not afforded with any kind of shortcutting or whatever. That helps a lot. And we even did a bit of this on Firewatch. Obviously, there are no enemies in Firewatch, so a lot of the gameplay systems are not translatable. It still is like a distantly related cousin to the so-called immersive sim, if you will, where generally like there's stuff in the world. The world itself is relatively persistent, even though it changes over time. And you're kind of just you move around the world at your own pace in the directions that you see fit. And so to solve these problems, we kind of like the kind of wayfinding, like, as we're playtesting the game, we're finding a lot of people are not able to get to find where the teens are camped out on the second day or whatever. So then we kind of leaned in. It's like, okay, well, what mechanical systems do we have in the game that can solve this? Well, there's someone else at the other end of that radio all the time. So Delilah is able to kind of like lead you in certain directions, and then there's this like big visual column of smoke that appears, and then you can talk to Delilah about that, and she goes, oh, that sounds like it's over by this blah 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 place. But those are solutions that are not portable to other types of games, right? So you just if you want to be more bold, and I think ultimately serve your game and the audience better, if you're not going to have just a bloody quest marker sitting on the screen, that the answer just depends a ton upon like what your game is, what its premise is, what the systems you have to utilize are. And I get that that's a much harder problem to solve. Like, you put that quest marker on the screen, it definitely works. For good or for ill. Mostly ill.
So moving on, kind of reel it back into Thief as a whole then. So the year came out, 1998. It feels more like the birth of the 3D stealth genre that year.
Oh, totally.
Because as well as Thief, you had just a few months earlier, Metal Gear Solid had just come out.
Yep.
And like
Tenchu the same year as well.
Yeah, dear God, Tenchu was the same year. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it was quite the year.
It was quite the year. Although to be fair, it was quite the year for games as a whole. Anyways, that year.
That's true.
That. Although to be fair, I think that's beaten it now, thanks to this year. But I digress. Even with just Metal Gear and Thief and Tenchu, it was such a golden era for what was the start of a brand new genre, at least anyways.
Yeah.
And
it's really quite, it's crazy that like kind of in parallel all those things, just came into the fore. It's cool. I think probably, a part of it was just, you needed the technology to catch up, right? But then also, you kind of needed to prime the pump for players' expectations. Like, certainly, Thief is not the first game that Looking Glass built that has a lot of that systemic richness, right? It's very much built on top of Ultima Underworld, as well as, I think, was System Shock first? I think System Shock was first, right?
I don't.
Or Thief? I think so.
I must check.
Yes. Oh, yeah. No, the first System Shock was like 1994. Yeah. So it's the same kind of thing where, they were like, Looking Glass had built upon having these like richly systemic first-person games, and then just the big innovation in Thief was like, okay, well, what if kind of the default world state is all the entities in the game don't know where you are, and that was it's interesting that like while that was the track that things were taking in the West, that there was this completely other track being taken in Japan, and then they just all happened to like bloom at the same time.
We've talked actually of quite a few gameplay aspects of Thief, but more or less the big core thing to it was that it used light and sound as a mechanic.
Yeah.
And that felt like a massive, massive game changer.
Oh, completely. That, like, I think that is also contributes a lot to just how much attention the player needs to play to the environment. Because, like, and I think Randy Smith, who worked on Thief 3 and actually the original Thief as well, I think, he talked about this at GDC many, many years ago, that, like, ultimately that game is about, the player reclaiming space from the enemies, right? Like, it's not really about defeating the enemies. Well, certainly you can do the thing where you just knock out every guard and stick them in the one room, and then the next morning when they all wake up, they really wonder what happened. But really, it's about, carefully and deliberately transforming the space back into a state that's advantageous to the player. And most of the player's verbs are different ways to do that, right? Like, you got your water arrows to put out torches. You've got your moss arrows to, dampen the sound on noisy surfaces. You got noise arrows that will move an enemy to a different area of the space, one that's more in your favor, right? So that, you have to spend because the main thing you're actually interacting with is not just the enemies, but it's the environment that the enemies are present in, that just really changes what you need to pay attention to, and kind of like what your just moment to moment goals are. And this is kind of the thing that, one of the defining characteristics of stealth games for me is that, unlike most, again, action adventure-y avatar controlling games, most games where you control a character, it's all about reacting, right? Like, you're either reacting to the environment because you're jumping onto the next platform in a cool Mario thing, or some enemies have been spawned and you need to get behind cover and blast them or whatever. But it's generally about reacting to the environment and the enemies in it. With stealth games, it's far more about being proactive, right? They're almost like strategy games where you're planning, 2, 3, 4 moves ahead, where you're like, okay, I know this guy is moving back and forth across this chunk of this hallway. That chunk of the hallway has a very noisy floor in it, and there's this bit of light in between here and there. So I'm going to need to extinguish this torch over here when he is in that chunk of the hallway where he won't see the light going out. Then I need to wait until he moves over here so then I can shoot a moss arrow on that chunk of the hallway, and then I can get through that hallway and pass the end of his patrol route before he turns around and spots me. And so it ends up being that you're like, yeah, you're kind of, and this kind of the core loop of the stealth game that we thought about as we're building Ninja. What's like kind of this 3-step process of like observe, plan, and execute, right? Where you are observing all the stuff in the environment, either the surfaces, both the environment and the entities in it. You're coming up with this plan of how you want to get through that space, and then you're actually going to attempt to execute that plan, and whether or not it will be successful is a whole other thing. But that kind of 3-step process is kind of the beating heart of stealth games.
There was a note that you mentioned that made me think of something. Like, in terms of the environment itself, like, could you argue that maybe that in itself is playing against you as a sort of enemy in the game?
Oh, completely. Oh, yeah. Like the way that the environment is built is just as much, if not more, the actual thing you're opposing as is like the entities in it, right? It's almost all like it's all this one big interconnected like clockwork machine where, certainly the enemies are like they're cogs, they're part of it, but the particular way that they're in that space matters a lot more. In most games, right? What is it like? Is there cover or not for the enemies to get behind? And obviously, there are plenty of great games that, the Halo and the Fear series and stuff, where the composition of the space and what the enemy AI utilizes that space does vary a wild amount. It still tends to be like quite, compartmentalized, where in games like this, it's just like there's way more entities and a way more interconnected space, and there's just like a lot more that the player has to think about and consider. And I think that also helps contribute to this feeling that this is like a real tangible place full of actual thinking entities that want to accomplish something.
We've already mentioned about Thief 2014 as a whole, but not as a whole, but you know what I mean. But like, what about the series as a whole? Especially, you mentioned it in part there, Rob the Cradle from Deadly Shadows, and how much Jordan Thomas had a hand in that kind of level. Especially considering how even some people say Deadly Shadows is one of the greatest horror games of all time, just for that level.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's like it's hard. I think it's hard to because a while ago, I think maybe a year or two after it came out, Kieran Gillen wrote this amazing piece about the Shailbridge Cradle in, I think, PC Gamer, and talking about it, it just feels like inarticulate compared to that. But while there were certainly a little bit more like ups and downs with Deadly Shadows, like it had this kind of more interconnected world, and there was some very interesting stuff there. I think the way that they actually utilized the antagonists and stuff was actually pretty interesting. I get why that didn't kind of feel the same to people. But like the series as a whole, I know a lot of people kind of think Metal Age is kind of their one, and certainly it's hard to argue with the improvements that have been made. And was it Life of the Party? I think that's the name of the mission in Thief 2 in Metal Age, which is just amazing. The first one will always just kind of be the one that glows the most brightly in my heart, because I kind of feel the same about Fallout, to be honest, where even though everyone loves Fallout 2, rightly so, that just like the first one will kind of always be the most special one to me. Especially with Thief, just because I'm just the dynamics of the story in the different series, where like, the first one is all about like, I mean, obviously the various factions, they're present in both games, right? Like you're dealing with the pagans and the Hammerites in all three of the games, and the Keepers in the background as they are. That just the first one, like just the weirdness of the pagans and kind of like that, kind of uncontrolled, wildness of like nature and storms. Like this thing is that like it's so much more interesting than just they're the bad guys, right? Like the trickster doesn't want to like wipe out the city and kill everyone. Not really, right? He is more like just this weird force of nature that kind of wants to change things because that is fundamental to his nature. And in the Hammerites, it's kind of the same thing, right? Where they're not like the bad guys. They're certainly of a particular ethos. But, they're the reason why the city has, like, walls and furnaces that keep people warm. And it isn't just full of crazed might makes right gangs and stuff like that. So the dynamics of, like, those two antagonists, or not antagonists, but like, I mean, they're kind of the antagonists, I guess. But like the dynamics of those two factions, those two entities as a group of people, kind of balanced by the keepers, is like, even that itself is just a much more uncommon and I think a bit more of an interesting way to present a world where there are these people whose goals don't align with yours, but they're not like the bad guys what want to blow up the world and kill everybody. And I think that's just like, that's a lot more of an interesting space to play in, no pun intended, because it does mean that, like, you can, like, there's a reason why Garrett doesn't want to kill everybody. And it's not just because he's not good at it, right? Is that, like, it would be very hard for him to just justify just, like, greasing every single Hammerite he comes across, because a lot of them are just like, they're just like people. So the fact that, like, the game's fiction also gives you a reason why the behaviors of your character and kind of the mechanics and the systems that exist in the game, it's like there's a reason why those things are the way they are, right? As compared to most games where, like, it's just this ham-fisted morality play. And even though it may have some, like, weird coding of, like, player choice in the middle, it's really just like, well, do you want to be the person who saves them puppies, or do you want to be the person who burns the orphanage down? That's not any more interesting, right? Just because you have a choice of which cartoonishly exaggerated end of the spectrum you want to be on doesn't actually make it that much more compelling. So yeah, that I think that, like, all three of those games, the series as a whole, again, kind of leaving off that fourth one for reasons, that they all kind of occupy different areas of just that world and that space in a way that I think is very cool, and that often some game series it just ends up like, and again, it's fine. Like, there's a lot of other refinements that could take place. So some game series, you just kind of get more of it. While it feels like with the Thief series that there was actually this very, like, coherent world, and each game gives you a different view into a big aspect of it in a way that I like and think is really cool.
What else do you like about Thief that we've not touched upon tonight?
I mean, we talked about the audio. Like, I think Stephen Russell's, like, world-weary kind of just, like, gravelly voice is still fantastic. That it does a lot with not very much in a way that I think is very cool, and that light touch actually gives you a lot of blanks to fill in yourself in a way that I think it does a lot of good world building without burying you in endless monologues or mega lore tomes that no one wants to actually read. What else? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we covered most of the stuff that I love about it, really. It's just, yeah, it is just like, just that emphasis on, a high degree of player agency and very intentional play in a bunch of really tangible, believable spaces. Even now makes that, like, while there are certainly other games that have picked up and carried this baton for sure, there still aren't that many. And it feels still very distinct even today. It's very cool. The more I haven't played it in a couple of years, but the more I talk about it, the more like, oh man, I actually need to go back and play it again.
What didn't you like about it?
Oh, nothing. It's the best game ever. No, I mean honestly, it's like I don't know, just because I'm sure that like no, even the idea of a flawless game, it's like that's a notion that's so absurd. It actually isn't even worth anyone's time to think about. So I'm sure there are some, like, playing it both the first time and times since, I'm sure there were things about it that didn't sit right with me. But they've just faded so much that, like, whatever shortcomings it may have had just didn't get in the way of all the stuff I liked about it so much. Yeah. Like, I'm sure that in my favorite movie there are performances that aren't great, or shots that are strangely lit, or whatever. I just don't notice those things because the stuff I like about it totally just blinds me to the stuff that might not be so strong. I'd have to think about that more. I don't know. Huh.
What would you change from a design perspective, then?
What would I change? I mean, I think a thing that would be, and of course this is very much hamstrung by, not hamstrung, but like certainly in 1998 this wasn't common, but like if there was some measure of greater continuity, like a more global reactivity to what you do, like even though the levels do feel like these these interconnected clockwork machines, it's still ultimately the case that like the stuff you do in this chunk of the level doesn't really matter that much to what may be on the other side of the level. And certainly in between levels, aside from the amount of money the amount of loot that you may make off with that lets you kind of fill your pockets for your loadout for the next mission, there otherwise isn't that much like dynamism or reactivity between the different missions. So that's certainly a thing that would be interesting to explore. The kind of low chaos, high chaos thing in Dishonored, I think, was one way to start to explore that idea. But I think there could be something there, just in terms of like making there be a little bit more global reactivity to the way you choose to approach certain things in the game. I don't know exactly what it would be, but I think there could be something potentially quite cool there.
When do you think is the moment Thief became your favorite game?
Oh man, probably by like the time I was to level 3. Certainly once I hit Constantine's mansion, and there was just stuff that I never imagined that I would see ever. That was the point where I was like, I mean, it already had me, but that was the point where it was like, not only was the hook fully sunk, but I was already like being reeled in on deck.
Top 3 Thief games, how would you rank them? Obviously, Thief OG at the top, and I'm guessing Thief 2014 way down at the bottom anyways.
Yes. I mean, it would honestly probably be just in order, like Thief 1, Metal Age, Deadly Shadows. Even though there is stuff that I like out of all of them in a way that numerical ranking doesn't necessarily capture. Yeah, for me, just like holistically, like again, because I love the Trailbridge Cradle so much that like Deadly Shadows probably has the highest highs, right? And just in terms of like the actual level of polish and excellence and improvements, like Thief 2 is probably the one that is like the engine is firing at its highest, not game engine, metaphorically speaking. It's like firing on all cylinders the most. Kind of the one that will always, for various reasons, do it for me above all the others is just good old Dark Project.
honorable mentions. Can you go for it?
God, this is so hard because I completely forgot. This is the thing you ask other people. I mean, Dark Souls would absolutely be up there. Probably, honestly, at this point, in parallel with Bloodborne, like I would have a hard time naming which of those I like more. I certainly have other feelings that are all extremely positive. Like all of Hidetaka Miyazaki's work is amazing, but I would go back and forth about whether or not Dark Souls or Bloodborne is my favorite of his games. Planescape Torment remains one of my favorite games of all time by a wide margin. I love me some Crusader Kings 2. Oh boy, do I ever. That is one PC-ass PC game, but I love it to death.
I think you mentioned Final Fantasy VI as well.
Yes, Final Fantasy VI also, like, in terms of that kind of, like, I don't have really, like, a huge vulnerability to nostalgia per se. Final Fantasy VI is one of the few, maybe the biggest exception. Like, even now, just hearing the music from that game, and I'm just like, I have been slammed in a wormhole back in time, and it just hits me in a way that is still, like, unlike almost anything else I've ever engaged with in media ever. I can't... That's kind of the one where... And I still like it. I mean, I still think the game is great. Like, it is obviously, you know, a Super Nintendo era JRPG, but I think the game is still amazing. But there's something about it where it's like, that is the one that is just... It hits all my nostalgia buttons to the max. Man, what else? Earthbound. I still got a love for Earthbound. It's just all old RPGs, I guess. Yeah, and even the more contemporary, like, successors to Thief, you know, Dishonored, I love to death. Yeah.
So, top 3 games ever. How would you rate them? Obviously, FIFA at the top, but how would you rate it?
That's so hard. I mean, it would probably be Thief, Bloodborne / Dark Souls, and then Planescape Torment.
Wow, I actually thought you'd maybe put Dishonored in there.
I don't know. If you asked me tomorrow, I would say something completely different. So maybe. Yeah, that one. That's it's so hard. Yeah, I don't know. Let's go with that for now. But it's very hard. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, our Caledonia's extremely minimal and functionally non-existent website is at caledonia.zone. But sometime in the future, that will be an actual real website that will be cool once we have a game we're talking about. In the interim, you can just follow me on Twitter at Nelsormensch. That's NELSORMENSCH. I have an ancient and increasingly overgrown blog that does have a link to a bunch of like talks I've given and stuff like that, including a bunch of much older writing that it is poorly maintained. But if you are curious about like having talked about some of this stuff in the past, that's at above 49, the numerals 49, above49.ca, and there's other like contact links on there as well.
Thanks for listening to My Favorite Game, a podcast on PlayDiaries.com where people in the games industry talk of their favorite game. On the last episode of My Favorite Game, The Lost Tapes, Jen Simpkins on The Witness. Until then, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.